Wow, that was nice. Um, well, I have to live up to that now. Try anyway. How many of you are from Montenegro? All of you? How many? Who isn't? How many of you are not from Montenegro? Some from Croatia, right? But you're all from the region. How many of you from outside the old Yugoslavia? Okay, if you're only the boring speakers at the front, right? Okay, well, you gave me a very generous introduction, but without wishing to be too hectoring, you don't, and I don't mean to accuse all Montenegrins of being the same, but I'm from North London, and there was a certain fellow from North London who came here a few months ago who didn't get such a good reception, not from you guys, but from some of your compatriots. You all know the story of Danny Rose. So I think before we start, we might just give Danny Rose a round of applause, and if Danny Rose... I will tell Danny that not all Montenegrins are as primitive as some of those guys in the match. So, thank you for that. Sometimes people say to me, well, how did you kind of see through, if that's the right word, all the lies of Silicon Valley, all the marketing spiel? Because I heard this is a marketing conference, right? No? Well, I saw on the website they said it was the biggest marketing conference in Southeast Europe. Are there any other marketing conferences in Southeast Europe? Anyway, I assume most of you are in marketing. I'm not in marketing. I'm on the other side. I'm in the business of telling the truth. Marketers, of course, are very good at telling stories, of selling things. I'm not saying that marketers tell lies, but some do, I think. Or certainly some of them stretch the truth. Some of them sell dreams. You know, I've got my Diet Pepsis on the, I don't know, where's Coca-Cola? You know, in America, on the West Coast, you never have Pepsi at these events. You only ever have Diet Coke. So, where are the Coca-Cola people here? I can't tell the difference. So, anyway, my business is kind of telling the truth, I guess, unless it suits me, and then I don't. But people say to me, well, how did you see through all this Silicon Valley crap? How did you kind of ride the wave in the first place? My background is as an entrepreneur, and then be critical. And I had another life, or another series of lives actually, before ending up in, most of the people who ended up, Jeremiah will tell you this, most people who ended up in San Francisco in the mid-90s were people who didn't have careers, who were kind of lost. And that's why I think the energy of the first wave of internet innovation in the 90s was so exciting, because it really did attract a kind of an itinerant group of people who didn't really know what they were doing. Now they all come out of business school and law school and that sort of thing. But when I came to Silicon Valley, I came as a kind of, and this may seem a contradiction in terms, a washed-up East Europeanist, which means that in my previous life I'd been an East Europeanist, and particularly someone, and I don't know if you take this word as an insult or a compliment, but someone with a particular interest in the Balkans and in Southeast Europe. And even though I look young, I'm not that young, and I lived in Sarajevo in 82, 83, before the Civil War, before the Olympics, and as an undergraduate I studied the modern history of Eastern Europe, and particularly of Yugoslavia, and also of the rest of East Europe. And I think one of the reasons why I kind of got what was happening in Silicon Valley was because I understood what happened in Titoist Yugoslavia. I understood the kind of the manufacturing of lies and the absurdity of what was going on in pre-Civil War Yugoslavia, and in Eastern Europe particularly, and in the Soviet colonization of Eastern Europe. So you guys might think of yourself as being maybe backward, or certainly less developed in technological terms than Silicon Valley and the West Coast. But actually your kind of historic your historic memories and experience are enormously valuable because things don't really change. We as human beings are always in the business, if not formally of marketing, of selling dreams, often selling lies, and then having to clean up the lies, having to figure out how to fix the future. Because the future, of course, is always about selling dreams, because the future hasn't happened. The future is tomorrow, the future is next week, the future is next year, the future is 2025. And whenever anyone mentions the future to you, they're selling you something. They're selling you a dream. They're selling you a startup. They're selling you a technology. They're selling you something that hasn't happened. Now, my background is also, in a previous life, as a historian. Historians aren't in the business of selling things. Historians are in the business of telling the truth. So I have one foot in the past, one foot in the future. And what I observed was that the promise, because of course this is a conference about the promise of technology, the promise of the way in which technology is supposedly making the world a better place. This is a seduction. My first book was called Cult of the Amateur, came out in 2007, but I originally wanted to call it The Great Seduction. The publisher turned it down because they said they didn't want a pornography book. But technology is always about a kind of seduction. My second book was called Digital Vertigo, which was a remix of Hitchcock's movie Vertigo. I'm not going to ask how many of you have seen it. I assume you've all seen it, and if you haven't, you shouldn't admit that publicly. The greatest movie ever made about desire and invention. And if there's one film you want to watch about marketing and the perils of lying, the perils of invention, watch Hitchcock's Vertigo, imagining a blonde woman who doesn't really exist, the great fantasy, of course, of men. But I've always been in the business of looking through the curtain, of seeing through the curtain, of exposing what really is going on. And it's always been about a kind of seduction. People always talk about, well, you drank the Kool-Aid. It may not be Diet Pepsi or Diet Coke, but we've all drunk that Kool-Aid. The fact that you're at this event means that at some point or other you've probably drunk the Kool-Aid. I drank the Kool-Aid of the technological revolution. As I said, I kind of arrived in Silicon Valley, I arrived in San Francisco in the mid-90s, a failed East Europeanist, which is quite an achievement, since there's only about 2 people in the world who want to become East Europeanists. But someone who was kind of looking for something to do in my mid-30s, and I found, like so many other people in the mid-90s, we found the internet. Now, of course, it was amazingly exciting at the time, this technology that was revolutionizing the world, and it was also amazing because we all thought we were going to get very rich. I'm not denying that. I didn't. Most people didn't. Some people did. But there was something else about it, too. This technological revolution was promising to make the world a better place. And I think there were 4 things in particular about the early internet that it seemed to promise, and in some ways still promises. And I want to build my conversation around that. The first is more democracy. We all know, of course, that this technology, even in the mid-90s, was, and I use this word disruption because it's become a kind of cliche, but it was deeply disruptive because it democratized media. Now everyone could publish anything they wanted on the internet. Now we had all access to technology that allowed us to make phone calls, allowed us to publish, allowed us to access content which historically had been controlled by big media companies. We also thought that we didn't have these mini computers, these mini supercomputers in our pocket back in the mid-90s. We carried around laptops, heavy laptops, and we didn't, some of us, I didn't even have a cell phone at the time. And there was no such thing in the mid-90s as a smartphone. But the technology was supposed to be democratizing. It was supposed to empower people. That was perhaps the most exciting thing about this technology. The other thing about the technology that was supposed to be so exciting was that it would create jobs. Now, as I said, I was an unemployed East Europeanist, so I quickly found a job in San Francisco. But we thought this technology, like the Industrial Revolution, would create a new wave of jobs, would give everyone work. I've always thought that work is ennobling, that as human beings, what defines us is our passion for work, which comes out in our creativity, which comes out in our discipline. So the idea of work, of jobs, of a new wave of technological innovation was also deeply exciting. Thirdly, and perhaps this is the one we should have begun with, we thought that this technology would enable the creation of what we might think of, what McLuhan called the global village, a place of cooperation and sympathy, a new kind of cultural renaissance, a place where people with this technology would be able to talk to one another. Now, Montenegro has also, because of its geography, been kind of cut off from the world. The mountains, when I lived in Sarajevo, it was really hard in the mid-80s or in the early 80s to get here. I remember getting a bus from Sarajevo to Dubrovnik, which at the time seemed to take all day. This is a hard country to find your way around because of the coast and the mountains. You guys know this better than I do. This technology was supposed to bring people together, to allow them to email each other. I remember many of us remember the first time we did email. At the time, we take it for granted now, but it seemed magical. This ability to be able to instantly message someone from Korea, someone from Montenegro, someone from London or Paris, someone from South Africa. All that seemed amazingly exciting. In itself, it was exciting, but it also promised cultural renaissance. It promised the ability of people from different cultures, different worlds, different opinions, different religions, different genders, different sexes, different forms of sexuality. It seemed to promise that everyone would be able to talk to one another. This was a place of collaboration, a place of community. And you guys in Southeast Europe, in the Balkans, know this story better than I do. We all know that the history of humanity has been one of division, of people fighting over identity, but this technology seemed to be something that would allow us to overcome this. And finally, we thought that it would give us freedom, that it would ennoble us as human beings, that we would be able to realize ourselves as human beings. Now, most of you look too young to have lived in the old Yugoslavia, but had you been there in Titoist Yugoslavia, you would have probably had to have read Marx's German Ideology, his famous early book about how technology would allow us to realize ourselves. And this was the great promise also, it seemed to me and many others in the 90s, of this digital revolution. That we would realize ourselves, that we would become freer, that we would allow ourselves to sculpt ourselves as better, freer, more meaningful human beings. So, democracy, jobs, cultural renaissance, freedom, these were the things that drove the first wave of the digital revolution. That was in the mid-90s. Now, about 25 years later, we can begin to analyze whether or not that promise has been realized. The marketing spiel, the seduction, the story, the blonde in the green Jaguar driving around San Francisco. Has that been realized? Are we 25 years later after the invention of the internet? Do we have more democracy? Are we freer? Do we have more cultural collaboration? Is there more work for everyone? Since we're supposed to be in the democracy business, let's have a show of hands. How many people believe that this has been realized? Oh my God. One person in the front, I bet they're a foreigner. We know, of course, and my career has been built on figuring out what's happened. When we look today at the digital landscape, we're looking, I think, at a landscape of broken promises. We're looking at a place where the future doesn't appear as attractive, as seductive as it originally did. Jaron Lanier, a friend of mine, who you all know him, He invented virtual reality, written a lot of very good books. He said that we used to believe in the future and now we don't believe in the future, and I think he's right. But why? What's happened? What is the narrative of what's gone wrong? Because if we're going to fix the future, if we're going to reimagine it, if we're going to repromise it, if we're going to get people to believe once again in the future, we have to understand what's gone wrong. The first, of course, the first thing that's gone wrong is this promise of democratization has actually resulted in many ways in a kind of mob rule. Sure, everyone has their hands on these devices. Everyone now can do social media. Everyone can do email, and in some ways that is empowering. I'm not denying that. But in 2007, I wrote a book called Cult of the Amateur. This was before Facebook. It was just as Facebook was becoming a company that, you know, even the readers of TechCrunch had heard of. In 2007, I wrote a book that suggests that when you have technology that does away with the authority of traditional media leaders, of editors, of authors, of fact checkers, in the long run you have a kind of anarchy. So sure, this technology has in a sense enabled people to make movies and put their photos up and write online, and there is no doubt that some people have made careers in that way. But the reality, I think, of the digital revolution to date is that the mob has replaced the traditional establishment, the traditional elites, and is creating a kind of an anarchy, a chaos. The media industry was dramatically undermined. It was promised that more and more people would have jobs. The reality, of course, is that many newspapers have gone out of business. The reality of the democratization of media is it hasn't stimulated democracy. Back in 2010, 2011, 2012, people were excited by the Arab Spring. That has, of course, collapsed into the Arab nightmare of endless civil war. The technology has resulted not in more democracy, but actually the rise of authoritarianism. It's no coincidence that throughout the world, the rise of Putin, the rise of Orban in Hungary, in Erdogan in Turkey, the appearance of Trump, all this is bound up in social media. People used to talk about Barack Obama as the first digital president, the first internet president, because his team did marketing well, online marketing, and that he used email and seemed comfortable with these devices. The reality, of course, is that Donald Trump is the first, at least in America, the first internet president. Not because he knows how to use Twitter, not because he carries a supercomputer around in his pocket. It's because he conforms to the reality of this new age. This technology was supposed to bring us together. It was supposed to make us more social, but it's actually dividing us. It's making us lonelier and lonelier. It's turning the world into a community, and that's the wrong word, but a collection of narcissists. So Trump's extreme narcissism, his failure to see other people's point of view, his cult of himself is itself a reflection of this new reality. And when we talk about the failure of the digital revolution, we're talking about the failure, I think, politically and culturally of the early part of the 21st century. Technology is the main event. It's reshaping every industry. This is no longer a kind of, technology is no longer a ghetto. It's not a place for geeks to escape the world. It's become the main event, the thing that's changing everything. Well, what about jobs then? Jobs were supposed to be created by the technological revolution, by the digital revolution. And of course, there's some truth to that. I have a job through perhaps my critique of digital, but many of you have jobs because of digital. But we know that the next great stage of the digital revolution is AI. This technology that mimics human beings, that replaces us, that does everything we do, but does it more effectively and reliably. Whether it's drive cars or analyze medical or legal problems or serve up hamburgers. Now, we're on the very brink. Jeremiah, I think, is more of an expert in terms of predicting concrete formal technologies. But we're on the brink of the most dramatic area of the digital revolution, which is the AI revolution. and the creation of, if you like, an algorithmic world driven, I think, mostly by 5G, which is another thing which will appear over the next 5 years. Most economists, and I interviewed many for my book, How to Fix the Future, are deeply depressed about this. Many economists believe that up to 40 or 50% of people who currently have jobs will be unemployed by this technology. We've created technology that rivals us. This is the Frankenstein parable. We've created something that's more effective and, of course, most importantly, cheaper than us, because using the algorithm is essentially free. So the self-driving car, the algorithm that figures out disease or legal problems, these are things which are fine if you own the algorithm, but for everyone else, for the traditional professions of the industrial world, whether they're factory workers, whether they're lawyers or doctors or engineers, the future is bleak. What about cultural understanding? As I said, we know that we have President Trump, but surely not everyone is Trump. Surely not everyone is a narcissist. McLuhan talked about the global village, but he did it ironically. McLuhan, I think, was perhaps, of all the great 20th century futurists, McLuhan was the guy who got it best. And when McLuhan talked about a global village, he was actually warning that we would fall back into the village. The villages of the old Balkan Peninsula, the villages which were parochial and hateful. This morning I opened up my internet to read the news, and there was a warning by the German Interior Minister telling German Jews, and we all know the history of Germany and the Jews, telling German Jews that they shouldn't wear the kippah, the religious symbol, which I'm Jewish, but I don't wear one, but many Jews wear because of the religious meaning of being Jewish. He warned Jews in Germany that they weren't safe to do this anymore. Germany, of all places, Germany, which incinerated 6 million Jews 50 years ago or 70 years ago. And someone said to him, well, why? What's going on? Because Germany, of course, seems so willing to take responsibility for this crime, perhaps the greatest crime ever committed by human beings and against another group of human beings. And he made it really clear. He said, it's the rise of social media, it's the internet, it's Facebook. Now, to blame everything on Facebook, Facebook's an easy straw man, an easy kicking it's easy to blame everything on Facebook. But the fact that this German minister is blaming the rise of anti-Semitism, a new kind of anti-Semitism, perhaps a more virulent kind of, and certainly a more virulent kind that's ever existed since the Second World War, because of social media, is deeply disturbing. Many women in the audience, you know the experience of being female on social media. We know the kind of hatred that is spewed on Facebook and on Twitter. We know the way in which the internet itself has become a kind of echo chamber, a place where we fall back into the 21st century version of village life, where we only surround ourselves with people who agree with us. There's no middle ground in social media. And the crisis, I think, of culture is self-evident. You just need to spend a few minutes on social media every day to understand what's really going on. And if that isn't bad enough, then we come to the fourth and perhaps the most important thing, which is freedom. Okay, so you might say, well, maybe there aren't going to be so many jobs. Maybe we haven't had democratic revolutions in the Middle East. Maybe not everyone sees eye to eye. But at least we're all free. At least we're more independent of the state. At least we're able to realize ourselves. And that's the biggest tragedy of all, of course. Recently, a book has been written called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by a woman called Shoshana Zuboff, a former professor at Harvard. She spent 7 years writing this book, and she nailed it. What Silicon Valley has created is surveillance capitalism. What Silicon Valley has done, particularly with its dominant companies like Facebook and Google, is create a model where we have sold our freedom, our sense of the self, our privacy, in exchange for free services like search engines or social media accounts. We know the dominant business models. We all get given this stuff for free, and they make billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars selling our data. So this phrase, a kind of euphemism, the big data economy, is actually an economy of us, economy of our information, economy of what we do and where we go and what we like and who we talk to. And the billions and tens, hundreds of billions of dollars that these companies are worth, and the profits and the revenue they generated is built around that, because Google and Facebook are advertising companies. 96% of their revenue comes through that. But they're super advertising companies. They're not traditional marketing companies. These are companies that know us better than we know ourselves. And with 5G, with self-driving cars, with smart homes, with smart devices, with smart cities, they're going to know us better and better. So freedom itself has been undermined, fundamentally, perhaps even profoundly in many ways. Now that's in the West. In authoritarian states like China, the politics have taken an even more disturbing shift, where the state has replaced these privately owned companies and are creating a new kind of Orwellian system, a place where the state knows everything about us. You in the Balkans know this history better than we do in the West, and are rewarding people through the Chinese social credit system to perfect a new, more viable form of totalitarianism in the 21st century. So the consequence is then the story is deeply disturbing. What we were promised hasn't been realized. There isn't more democracy, there isn't more freedom, there aren't more jobs. There is no more equality. Democracy and equality kind of go together. We know that the 9 richest billionaires in Silicon Valley are worth now about the same amount of money as the 2.5 billion poorest people. And the wealth from these small companies hasn't gone to us as users, hasn't gone to us as partners. It's gone to a tiny group of incredibly wealthy technologists and their investors. So what are we going to do about this? We know the thing's fucked. We know there's a huge problem. I don't mean to end this conference on such a miserable note. Now, in the old days of Yugoslavia, I don't know if Gilas came up with this, but there were certainly kind of hardcore Titoist philosophers who talked about something called the laws of history, that history was somehow inevitable. This stupid idea that Lenin and his friends got their hands on was particularly absurd and particularly troubling, because it undermined us as human beings. As I argue in my book, I'll repeat it again, if you haven't read it, you need to buy it, How to Fix the Future. Our history as a species has always been built on our ability to break the future and then fix it. We are always breaking the future. We broke it in the middle of the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. It took us 100 years to fix, and some of the problems of the Industrial Revolution, particularly global warming, aren't fixed. Throughout history, we break things and then fix them. The reason we fix them, what defines us, which distinguishes us from other species, is our agency. The word agency, then, is key in terms of learning how to fix the future. Fixing the future requires us to act. I think the mistake of the first wave of digital revolutionaries like myself was we never understood the role of agency. We thought that technology would do it on itself. We assumed that technology by definition was somehow good, that it would result in more democracy, more economic equality, more jobs, more cultural understanding, more freedom. We were wrong. Technology doesn't think for itself. Technology doesn't have a mind of its own. Technology is made by us. And just as it's made by us, it can be unmade by us. And I think the great crisis of our age aren't the things that I describe. Those are the consequences of the crisis. The great crisis of our age is that many of us don't feel able to change stuff. many of us don't feel as if we have agency. Many of us feel as if, well, Google is so big, so international. Facebook seems so inevitable. Apple is so powerful. AI is inevitable. Blockchain is inevitable. 5G is inevitable. What can we do? So that's the great question. What can we do? Because we can't rely on others. And this question is as relevant for you in Montenegro as it is for me in San Francisco. This is the great question of our age. Just as it was the great question of our age in the middle of the 19th century, when you had 11-year-olds working in factories, when cities were uninhabitable because of the smog, where unions weren't allowed, where the inequality between property owners and the laboring classes were even bigger than they are today. So what are we gonna do? And that's the focus of my book and my thinking now. You know, I spent 10 years arguing that the digital revolution had gone wrong, that it was driving us in ways that we were going to regret. I had a chat with Jeremiah earlier, and he's more of a Silicon insider than I am, and he said, yeah, everyone believed the opposite. Now everyone's come around to my position, and it's boring to have the same argument as everyone else. So the great question now isn't whether or not it's gone wrong. We know it's gone wrong. None of you stuck up your hands when I asked you if you believed in the future anymore. The question now is, how do we manifest agency? Now, in my book, I outline 5 core areas, and in fact, I even come up with my own kind of cute term for agency. You all know the term Moore's Law, deriving from Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel, who in 1967 came up with the idea that every 18 months the power of computer chips would double in their power. This is what has made, over the last 50 years, this is why now I can carry a supercomputer around in my pocket, whereas 50 years ago it wouldn't have fitted into this room. Well, I come up with another kind of Moore's law. That's a technological law. It's a law about technology. It's neither good nor bad. It's not a moral law. It's observing something scientific. And it's still the thing that's driving the revolution. I come up with another kind of Moore's law. But rather than M-O-O-R-E, Gordon Moore of Intel, I come up with M-O-R-E's law, derived from Thomas More, the 16th century English philosopher and political activist who wrote Utopia. More reminded people back then, More was the humanist who argued that we are responsible in Utopia for handing over to our children a better society, and that's our responsibility. More interestingly enough, in his day, in the beginning of the 16th century, was involved in a great debate with Martin Luther being the Protestant reformer who believed in the idea of predestination, that God was so immense that humans couldn't really change their fate. Today, then, the great debate is between what I like to think of as humanists like myself, who believe we can shape the future, and technological determinists, and there are many of those, whether they're the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world or the Kevin Kellys, who believe somehow in the inevitability of technology. So what to do? How are we going to fix this thing? As I said, I came up with 5 buckets, 5 pillars for trying to fix the future. The first, this is not the only pillar, but I begin with it because it's probably the most controversial, but also the most obvious, is regulation. The failure of Silicon Valley over the last 25 years in many ways can be understood because it was unregulated, because Silicon Valley guys always said to Washington, D.C. or any other kind of political regulators, just keep away. You don't understand this stuff. You don't get technology. You're only going to slow us down. So you got the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world who said, move fast and break things. And the faster they moved and the more they broke, the more politicians seemed irrelevant. But the reality of the failure of the Silicon Valley revolution, whether it's the hate on social media, whether it's the economic inequality, whether it's the irresponsibility of companies like Facebook, unwillingness to acknowledge their problems, is because they've been unregulated. A lot of people say, well, what's Europe's role in all this? Europe doesn't get it. Europe as a laggard. Europe barely has any unicorns. Europe is a leader in one area. Europe is a leader in regulation. So what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is Europe fighting back, to regulate these companies, as all great companies need to be regulated, as the industrial companies were regulated, as they were broken up by antitrust investigators, as you had regulation that allowed the creation of unions and banned 11-year-olds working in factories. Today we have regulation coming from Europe. The Europeans are forcing these companies to pay their taxes. The Europeans are coming up with regulation which makes sure that companies allow people to carry their data around with them. That's what the General Data Protection Regulation is. Europeans are forcing these companies to be accountable for the garbage that gets published on their platforms. So the Germans, for example, have come up with a law which punish Facebook financially, many millions of dollars every time anyone publishes anything on their platform, which is illegal. This is perfectly correct. After all, newspapers get punished for the same thing, and Facebook is monetizing all that opinion anyway. So regulation matters. Forcing these companies to pay taxes, making them accountable for their content, breaking them up perhaps, or at least having antitrust investigations that show that much of the things they're doing are illegal. Regulation, which I think, and as I said in my book, I spent some time with a woman called Margaret Vestager, who's the EU Commissioner of Antitrust. She is trying to create a level playing field. We're only going to get a level playing field if you get regulation. She's not biasing European companies. She's not even biased against large companies. She's simply creating a level playing field. That's what we need, and that's why regulation matters. But regulation in itself is not sufficient. At the end of these kind of speeches, someone will always stick up their hand and say, well, what is regulation? It goes back to the state. The state doesn't get it. Government people don't get it. Government people, some government people get it, firstly, but secondly, regulation doesn't work on its own, just as the regulation of the Industrial Revolution didn't work on its own. The second thing we need is more innovation. We need more human innovation. I have lots of examples of my book of entrepreneurs learning from this first wave of innovation to create business models which are better, which are fairer, and where they can still make money. So it's increasingly self-evident that the dominant Silicon Valley model doesn't work. It's clear that the big data economy is simply creating a kind of surveillance society where people are being watched all the time and will be more and more watched as the technology becomes more ubiquitous. So we need technologists, entrepreneurs to come up with new business models because people want social media. They want search engines. They want apps. They want gadgets. But people don't want to be watched all the time. People don't want to have their souls investigated by algorithms or by companies based in Mountain View or Silicon Valley. So the challenge then, and I have some examples of early companies that are trying to do this, the challenge is coming up with a new wave of innovation, a new kind of culture of being an entrepreneur and learning from the failure of the first wave. I think the other thing that's important in terms of entrepreneurs is that they've got to stop drinking the Kool-Aid. You see this sometimes with blockchain now. Oh, these Bitcoin entrepreneurs or these blockchain entrepreneurs, they say, oh, this, Don Tapscott does this, the Canadian writer. Oh, this is really the internet. This is going to change everything. Technology will finally free us. We've got to get beyond that. We've drunk the Kool-Aid too many times with technology. Technology is not a solution to the problems of technology. There is no app to fix the future. Only we as human beings can fix this stuff. Technology matters, it's important. Technology is inevitable in some ways, but there's nothing inevitable about the business models. There's nothing inevitable about the applications. We also need consumers to step forward. It's increasingly clear that the products that we have are bad for our health. Some people are even saying that Facebook should come with a little sticker like a cigarette pack saying this thing will kill you. It's certainly killing others in terms of the kind of behavior it's encouraging. But what's clear is that that consumers need to wake up. Consumers need to wake up to the harm this is doing them and their families. There are analogies in the past. There are industries. Some people will say, well, consumers like it. It's free. It isn't free, as I suggested. There are analogies in the past from other industries that I talk about in my book. In the 1950s, the American car industry was completely dominant. It dominated the entire world. Everyone either drove or aspired to drive American cars. And the American car industry, like the American tech industry, became fat and lazy and arrogant and began to design products that were profoundly, inherently, intrinsically bad for people. They were death traps. They were coffins on wheels. In the mid-1960s, a consumer advocate called Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed that exposed the corruption of the American car industry and how bad these cars were. This was a huge bestseller, and the American car industry, perhaps with the footnote of Tesla, has never really recovered since. The German and the Japanese car industries were both, the success of the German and Japanese car industries was built on safety. The same is true in the food industry. Many of the products, and we know this from some of the acknowledgement, many of the products in Silicon Valley have been designed to be addictive. They're the digital version of this, which is why I have two cans on the stage. They're designed, and the social media platforms are designed to be, the euphemism is sticky, but the reality is that they're designed to be addictive. And not only are they addictive, but they're bad for us in the same way as this stuff is bad for us, in the same way as fast food is bad for us. But the history of the food industry is also interesting. In the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, all food was like this. It was expensive, it was exploitative, and it was bad for us. Today we have the rise of the real food movement. We have more and more consumers wanting better quality products and being willing to pay for it. I think consumers have to acknowledge that if they want good stuff, in physical terms or in digital terms, they have to pay for it. So I'm hopeful that the consumer revolution is beginning, and it probably begin in Silicon Valley, but it's going to take some time. So we have regulation, innovation, consumer power. We also need citizen engagement. All of us are citizens in some way or other. I have a whole section where different kinds of citizens are working to better the digital revolution. Lawyers working against companies like Uber to make sure that Uber protects the rights of their drivers. New kinds of venture capitalists who are not willing to invest in companies that are bad for society. I have lots of examples of that. If any of you are VCs, you no longer have the right, I think morally, to invest in companies just because they're going to make money. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't want to make money, but there are moral criteria as well. And I think many of the people to blame for the failure of the digital revolution are the VCs, whose only focus was profitability. We have the rise of a new wave of innovative, of aware, of socially conscious engineers in Silicon Valley. Some people even believe that engineers should sign a kind of a promise, like doctors do, to make sure that the products they're designing aren't addictive. We could all do something as citizens, as teachers, as parents, as lawyers, as voters. We should be voting, I think, for people like Elizabeth Warren or Margaret Vestager, people committed to cleaning up tech, to addressing the problems of the digital revolution, and making sure in particular that the AI revolution doesn't destroy all our jobs. Finally, last but not least, is education. We need to stimulate a new kind of human being in the digital age. In the industrial age, the school system was top-down. It was designed to train orthodoxy. It was designed to train conformity. It was designed in a way to make kids into mini computers. And the reason for that, of course, is that weren't computers. They weren't competing with algorithms. They weren't competing with this. They had to know their math. They had to know their engineering and their law. Today, we have these devices, and we've created AI that mimic ourselves in many ways. We've created AI that does math and law and most other kinds of quantifiable things in a much more effective way. So what can education do? What can education do to stimulate us for the future? Some people say, well, just get all kids to learn code. Turn schools into coding schools. Make sure that every kid has this in their pocket and everyone has an iPad. But that's entirely wrong. The reality is, if we're going to survive in this new world, if we are really going to carve out a relevant place for us in the age of the algorithm, which has been created to mimic us, we have to figure out something that the algorithm can't do. Not only do we need to figure it out, but we need to do it very well. We need to establish or re-establish our dominance over the algorithm. And we go back to the A word, agency, because that's the thing that the computer doesn't have. As Ada Lovelace, the brilliant 19th century British Victorian mathematician who invented the very idea of software. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, a remarkable woman, the business partner of Charles Babbage, who invented the first physical mechanical computer. As Lovelace noted right in the middle of the 19th century, software can't think for itself. It doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't have goals. It doesn't have agency. And that's where the role of schools is so important. We need to rethink the role of education. We need to stimulate agency. We need to teach creativity. We need to make sure that children are not becoming algorithms. Now, there are innovative education models around. I talk about them at the end of the book. There's the Waldorf system, which was invented in Middle Europe, in Vienna, after the First World War, that focuses on creativity, where teachers, the whole essence of teaching is stimulating what they call the muscle of creativity. That's where we need to go in the long term. It's rather ironic, of course, and depressing that the most popular and expensive and hardest schools to get into in Silicon Valley are Waldorf schools. Steve Jobs didn't let his kids carry these things. You know, Steve Jobs, who invented this, didn't let his kids have them in the home. He didn't let them have iPads. The same is true of the executives of Google and Facebook. They're sending their kids to Waldorf schools because they know the skills of the future are not built on programming. They know that if you try to turn yourself into an algorithm, you'll lose to the algorithm. So the future of education requires a kind of mass democratic response to the digital revolution. It's going to take time, these things: education, regulation, innovation, consumer power, citizen engagement. It took 50 to 100 years to fix, as I said, many of the most salient and troubling aspects of the Industrial Revolution, and it still hasn't been fixed. Every problem creates a new problem. We're not going to solve these things. We're not going to arrive in a digital utopia. We've got to get away from that discourse. There is no end of history. You in Eastern Europe know that better than anyone. There is no final realization, no Hegelian moment. But we need to move fast. We have 20, 25 years to fix these deeply disturbing early problems of the digital revolution, but they won't get fixed alone. It's not just Margaret Vestager or the next Steve Jobs. It requires all of you, whether it's Montenegro, whether it's Silicon Valley, whether it's New York, whether it's Paris or London or Hamburg or Berlin. We need to work together. If we're going to fix the future, we need to start now. Thank you.